It was a warm afternoon when Aliyah stepped out of her apartment, her mind busy with errands. She didn't expect much from the day, just the usual routine. Picking up groceries, taking care of a few things around the house, and then heading home. But when she stepped onto the sidewalk, things took an unexpected turn. Aliyah was walking calmly when she noticed a police car parked at the corner of the street. At first, she thought nothing of it. It wasn't unusual for officers to patrol the area, but as she walked closer, something felt off. The officer inside the car was staring at her, his eyes fixed in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As Aliyah continued walking, she noticed the officer getting out of the car. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a look on his face that made her stomach twist. There was a certain arrogance in the way he carried himself, a sense of superiority that was impossible to ignore. She had seen that look before, from people who thought they could get away with anything just because they wore a uniform. Without saying a word, the officer approached Aliyah. His steps were firm, purposeful. She could feel her heart begin to race, but she tried to stay calm. She didn't know what this officer wanted, but she didn't want to make any trouble. "Hey, you," the officer barked suddenly, his voice harsh. Aliyah froze, her body tensing. She looked up at him, trying to keep her composure, but the officer was already too close. His expression was cold and demanding, and his tone left no room for negotiation. "Why are you walking around here?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Aliyah didn't understand why he was asking her such a question. She had done nothing wrong. But before she could respond, the officer's hand shot out and grabbed her arm. Aliyah's eyes widened in shock. The officer's grip was tight, and his fingers dug into her skin. She tried to pull away, but he yanked her harder, forcing her off balance. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what had just happened. Why was he acting this way? And why did he think he could treat her like this? Before she could even think of a response, the officer raised his hand and slapped her across the face. Aliyah stood there, her cheek still burning from the slap. The officer's handprints seemed to linger on her skin, like a cruel reminder of how powerless she felt in that moment. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The shock of it left her frozen, her mind struggling to make sense of the sudden violence. Her heart raced, and a knot tightened in her stomach. She had expected to be stopped, maybe questioned, but never treated like this. Her body trembled, but she knew she had to stay calm. She couldn't let herself fall apart. People had been wronged before, even hurt, and they had to find a way to fight back. But Aliyah wasn't sure what to do now. The officer stood there, looking down at her as if he were in full control, but she could see a glint of something behind his cold eyes. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of the consequences, of being held accountable. She was just another black woman to him, someone he could push around without thinking about the damage it could cause. "You're going to regret this," Aliyah said quietly, her voice shaky but firm. She was scared, but she didn't want to show it. There were people in her neighborhood who had been wronged by the police, people who had suffered worse than this, and they had to find a way to speak out. She had to find a way to stand up for herself. The officer stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. "You're not in a position to make demands," he sneered. "You're lucky I'm not taking you in right now." The words hit her like a slap all over again, but this time, she felt a spark of anger ignite inside her. She had heard stories of police abusing their power, of black people being unfairly treated, and now she was the one standing in front of a man who thought he could do whatever he wanted. She wasn't going to be another victim. Not today. Not ever. Her mind raced, thinking of what to do next. She could feel the weight of every moment, knowing that one wrong move could make everything worse. But she wasn't about to let fear control her. Deep down, Aliyah knew she had to stay strong. She couldn't let this man take away her dignity. Not now. Not ever. Aliyah's heart was pounding in her chest as the officer towered over her. She could feel his gaze on her like a weight pressing down, and every part of her wanted to run. But she knew that wouldn't help. Running would only make things worse. She had to stay, to face him, even though every instinct screamed at her to leave. The slap still stung, and the humiliation was eating away at her, but she refused to let him see how much it affected her. "Call the cops." "I'll deal with this," the officer said, his tone filled with arrogance. His confidence only made Aaliyah feel smaller. He was used to this kind of power, used to walking away without consequences. But she wasn't about to let that happen. Aaliyah's hands shook slightly as she pulled out her phone. She had no idea how to react. But one thing was clear. She needed help. She knew who to call. The one person who would make sure things didn't end quietly, who would stand up for her, no matter the cost. She hit the dial button, her thumb pressing the numbers with a trembling hand. "Marcus," she said as soon as he picked up. Her voice was tight, barely a whisper, but he could hear the fear in it. "I need you. Now." On the other end of the line, Marcus's voice was immediately alert, filled with concern. "What's wrong? Where are you?" Aaliyah tried to steady herself. "I'm at the corner by the diner." "The cop, he slapped me, Marcus. He's threatening me, and I don't know what to do." She could hear the anger in her son's voice before he even said anything. "Stay there. I'm on my way." Aaliyah hung up the phone, her stomach in knots. She didn't know if things would get better, but at least Marcus was coming. At least she wasn't alone. The officer still stood there, watching her, and she could feel his smugness like a thick cloud around them. He was in control, or at least he thought he was. But she knew something that he didn't. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated her son. As Aaliyah waited for Marcus to arrive, the minutes felt like hours. The officer paced nearby, clearly trying to figure out how to get out of the situation without drawing too much attention. He probably thought Aaliyah would just give in, that she would back down like so many others had. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Her mind raced, but all she could do now was hold on, wait for her son, and hope that Marcus would know what to do. He was her strength, her protector, and right now, she needed him more than ever. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever as Aaliyah stood there, trying to remain composed. The officer paced nearby, his eyes never leaving her. He was trying to act casual, but Aaliyah could feel the tension in the air. His posture was stiff, like he was preparing for something. But she had no idea what. Every second that passed, she felt the weight of the situation growing heavier. She could hear the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of leaves in the wind, but it all felt so distant, like the world was slowing down. She kept looking down the street, hoping for a glimpse of Marcus. Every car that passed made her heart skip a beat, but none of them were the one she was waiting for. She could feel the officer's eyes on her, studying her every move. He didn't say anything else, but his presence was suffocating. He thought he had control, that he could push her around and get away with it. But Aaliyah wasn't going to let that happen. Finally, in the distance, she saw it. A black car rounded the corner, its headlights cutting through the evening darkness. Aaliyah's heart leaped in her chest as she recognized the vehicle. It was Marcus. She felt a surge of relief, but also a fresh wave of anxiety. She didn't know what would happen when Marcus showed up, but she trusted him. She knew he wouldn't let her down. The car pulled up to the curb, and Marcus got out, his tall frame standing strong. Aaliyah could see the determination in his eyes, the fire that burned within him. He had always been protective of her, always been there when things got tough. And this time, it wasn't going to be any different. The officer noticed Marcus approaching and immediately stiffened. He was still trying to maintain control, still holding on to his illusion of power. But now, there was a shift in the air. Marcus's presence was commanding, and the officer could see it. He knew the moment Marcus stepped out of the car, things had changed. "Hey," the officer barked, his voice rising with a hint of panic. "You need to stay out of this." Marcus didn't even look at the officer as he walked toward Aaliyah. His focus was entirely on his mother. "You okay, Mom?" he asked quietly, his voice calm but filled with concern. Aaliyah nodded, relief washing over her. But the officer wasn't backing down. I said stay out of it, he repeated, his tone harsh. Marcus finally turned to face him. You're the one who needs to stay out of this, he said, his voice firm, a dangerous calm settling over him. You put your hands on my mother. Now you're going to deal with me. The officer took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt, but he didn't pull out his weapon. Instead, he hesitated, his eyes flicking between Marcus and Alia. The tension between the three of them was thick, and for the first time, the officer seemed uncertain. He had made a mistake, and he knew it. The officer stood there, his hand still hovering near his belt, but he didn't draw his weapon. Marcus could see the officer's uncertainty, and it was a moment of power. Alia could feel her breath catch in her chest. This was the moment that could change everything. Her son had arrived, and he was standing up for her, but the officer wasn't backing down yet. The air between them crackled with tension. Marcus didn't flinch. His eyes locked with the officer's, a calm determination in his gaze. You put your hands on my mother, he said, his voice steady and low, but it carried authority. I don't care what badge you wear, but you're going to pay for that. The officer tried to stand his ground, but Alia could see the doubt in his eyes. He had messed up. Big time. He wasn't prepared for someone like Marcus, someone who wasn't going to let it slide. The officer had assumed he could get away with anything, but Marcus wasn't scared. He wasn't going to back down. And now the officer had to deal with that. The officer's eyes flicked to Alia, his lips curling into a sneer. You think I'm afraid of you? He spat, but there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his fear. You better think again. I've dealt with people like you before. Marcus's expression didn't change. You've dealt with people who let you walk all over them, he said, taking a step closer to the officer. I'm not one of them. The officer shifted, suddenly realizing that he wasn't in control anymore. His bravado began to crumble as Marcus's words settled in. Alia stood behind Marcus, feeling the surge of pride. Her son wasn't just defending her. He was standing up for what was right, showing this officer that he couldn't abuse his power without consequences. The officer hesitated, his hand slowly dropping from his belt. Alia could see him calculating his options, but his choices were limited. He knew that with Marcus here, things were about to get a lot more complicated for him. Alia's heart raced with a mix of fear and hope. She knew this wasn't over yet, but with Marcus here, things were shifting in her favor. The officer let out a frustrated sigh, looking away from Marcus. It was clear he had no idea how to handle this. Alia could see the fear in his eyes now. He was no longer the one in control, and it was a feeling that was slowly sinking in for him. He was on the edge, unsure of what would happen next. The officer took a step back, his gaze darting nervously between Marcus and Alia. For the first time, Alia could see a crack in the officer's tough exterior. The confidence he had walked in with was quickly fading. It wasn't just Marcus's presence, it was the fact that he had underestimated them both. He had thought Alia would be an easy target, someone he could intimidate without consequences. But now, with Marcus here, the power had shifted, and the officer wasn't sure how to respond. Marcus stood his ground, unwavering, his eyes still locked on the officer. He didn't move, didn't even flinch, and the officer could feel the weight of his stare. Alia could see that Marcus wasn't going to back down, no matter how much the officer tried to regain control. Why don't you just walk away? The officer said, his voice wavering slightly. He clearly wasn't used to someone challenging him like this. You don't know who I am. I can make your lives miserable. Marcus didn't flinch. You're the one who's made a mistake, he replied. His voice was calm, but there was a fire behind his words. You think you can get away with hurting people because you wear a badge. Not today. The officer looked around, as if trying to find an escape route, but there was nowhere to run. The street was quiet now, with only the distant hum of traffic in the background. Alia could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but it was no longer just out of fear. It was out of anticipation. She was beginning to feel like the officer was no longer the one in charge. Suddenly, the officer's expression softened, almost like he was trying to backpedal. "Look, it was a misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice now filled with desperation. "I didn't mean to." "No," Marcus cut him off sharply. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You slapped my mother, and that's not something I'm just going to let slide." Aaliyah could see the officer's arrogance slip away completely. He had expected fear, maybe even a few words of apology, but he wasn't getting that from Marcus. Instead, he was met with unwavering strength. The officer stood frozen for a moment, clearly struggling with the situation. He had realized that Marcus wasn't just any bystander. He was her son, and he wasn't going to let this go. His confidence was completely shattered. The power dynamic had completely shifted. The officer's posture sagged, his earlier confidence completely gone. Marcus's unwavering gaze and calm demeanor were like a wall the officer couldn't break through. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself, and that was something the officer wasn't used to. He had spent his career holding power over people, but now, in front of Marcus, that power seemed meaningless. Aaliyah could see it now. The officer was no longer the threat. He had become the one who was afraid. His hand no longer hovered near his belt, and his words lost the bite they once had. His body language was telling. His shoulders slumped as if he were trying to shrink away from the situation. Marcus didn't give him any room to regain his composure. "You're not walking away from this," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You're going to answer for what you did." The officer opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. He took another step back, as if the space between him and Marcus was somehow growing larger with each passing second. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, but he was trapped. He had hoped this would blow over, but Marcus wasn't giving him that option. Aaliyah stood there, feeling a strange mix of relief and anger. Relief because she knew Marcus wouldn't let this go. Anger because the officer had dared to hurt her, thinking he could get away with it. But now, with her son standing beside her, everything felt different. The tables had turned, and she could see the fear in the officer's eyes. The officer stammered, trying to find his words. I didn't mean to. It was just a mistake." His voice cracked slightly, a sharp contrast to the way he had been speaking just minutes before. Marcus shook his head. "It wasn't a mistake. You hurt my mother, and now you're going to face the consequences. It's not over." The officer took one last look at Marcus, his face pale and strained. He realized he had no choice but to back down. With a quick, final glance at Aaliyah, he turned and walked away. Every step was a reminder that the power had shifted entirely. Aaliyah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She looked at Marcus, her heart swelling with pride. He had stood up for her in a way she couldn't have imagined, and in doing so, he had made the officer understand that actions have consequences. She smiled at him, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. The danger was over for now, but the lesson was clear. No one, no matter how powerful they seemed, could escape accountability when people stood together.